There is a question which has been rattling around my brain for a long time now. And to be honest, I don't know how to answer it. But I don't think it's my fault, because cricket has never really helped us all that much at all. That's because the question is, who is the best coach in the world at the moment? And I'm sure some of your friends will have very strong opinions. But that's all they can be, right? Opinions. It is the most subjective question. And we talk about coaches being good, being bad all the time, but I'm not even sure if we even know what any of that means. And best coach, that's a bit tough, right? But what if I asked you to say the top 3? In fact, what I asked a bunch of different people in my cricket community was top 10. And still, no one really had a good answer for it. In fact, they were petrified to even say anything with certainty. And at a certain point, asking who the best coach is in cricket is an almost pointless endeavor because of how little we actually talk about coaches in our sport. And to point all this out, I want to look at Matthew Mott, who recently lost his job with England, right? And if this was a normal coach, we'd be taking apart his career block by block. And many people would point out that he's the only coach to have won women's and men's world tournaments, right? That's a pretty big deal. You look at all those 3 different titles across 2 different genders, which is a completely different kind of coaching, and you say he must be a great coach. But of course, he also lost a couple of tournaments with the England men, a team that we all thought, certainly going in, was a pretty safe bet for at least making the finals in some situations, or at least pushing for the final. And they did neither. And the other thing that you would point out is the 2023 Women's World Cup, which Australian women won without Matthew Mott being involved, right? Does he get credit for that or not? Because when you really look at Matthew Mott's entire career here, what you see is that he was involved in perhaps the most advanced cricket program we've ever seen. The Australian women had so many advantages over all of their opposition that they were just in a world of their own. And he also came into one of the best men's white ball situations with the England team as well. So is Matthew Mott an absolute genius at setting up situations? Or is he a person who happened to stumble into 2 of the easiest to coach positions of all time? Everyone's going to have their own opinion on that. But at a certain point, where does Matthew Mott fit into this top 10 list? He's just lost his job, but he hasn't forgotten how to coach, even if his time at England didn't end particularly well. So if you're asking me how good Matthew Mott is, I'm going to have to be honest, right, and say I have no idea. I don't know whether he should be in the top 10. I don't know if he should be in the top 3. I don't know really if he should be thought of as one of the best coaches in the world. And it's easier to say he doesn't fit into any of these categories right at the moment, as the England fans are yelling at their screens, because he wasn't doing particularly well with England and he's just lost his job. But he was doing this beforehand, right? I'm not sure he's a worse coach now just because at the end of his England run ended poorly. Most great coaches end their runs fairly poorly. And of course, this is all subjective anyway. But what I really wanted to look at is, do we even have the tools available to us or the discussion points that we need to work out who the best coaches in cricket are? How do you work out where Matthew Mott fits in when we don't have any conversations at all about who the best coaches are, what good coaching actually means, or any kind of framework to start this discussion? What is a good cricket coach? If you love cricket on a deep spiritual level and want to be involved when no matches are being played, we have the game for you. Hit Wicket is so good that Shipperd and me have backed it. And that's a lot of nerd energy behind one game. This is a strategic game of cricket, and it's not just about whacking your screen really, really hard with your finger. This isn't a game where you swipe all around to try and hit the ball. You work out what works best based on real-life cricket situations. For instance, dot balls bring pressure, 1s and 2s lead to 4s. There is no way you can just hit a 6 every ball or take wickets all the time. This is proper cricket, yet it still has some special gaming powers in there as well. And so this game is about playing, but also building and managing your team. You are the batter, bowler, owner, coach, captain. It's your dream, right? And there are no ads, it's just cricket. Download Hit Wicket now and bring out the cricket legend in you, because Hit Wicket is a cricket game made for you and supported by other cricket nerds. Stick it in your pocket today. This was made using MV Play's Insights. The same technology that supports the England and New Zealand test players is available to club cricketers as well. So Dan Vettori had this incredible run a couple of years ago at getting all the best coaching jobs around the world. All the other coaches were very, very jealous of him. He had a job in the Big Bash, he had a job in the IPL, he had a job in the Blast, he was going everywhere he wanted and coaching. And of course, Dan Vettori, hell of a player, lovely person, everyone was happy for him, except for the fact that it was quite clear that the majority of the teams that he was looking after weren't actually winning. In fact, not only were they not winning, they were doing really poorly. But the issue was, how bad was his actual record? And that was really hard. Enter Tim Wigmore, who was as fascinated by this as anyone else, who essentially had to go and count up Vettori's record to work out how many games he'd won and how many games he'd lost. It turned out at that point that Vettori hadn't won many at all. And after that article came out, people were actually discussing Daniel Vettori's coaching record. And to be honest, he probably got fewer offers after than he did before, just because we actually had a number we could point to. And when it comes down to it, I think all sports have problems with the sort of more subjective nature of what is a good coach. Like, did they just have a good team? Did they have a bad injury run? Did they have a bad owner or general manager, or their selectors no good, or whatever? We can make all of those cases for pretty much all coaches. It's always tricky to work out who your sport's best coach is, right? But in a lot of sports, what we have is something called records. It's really interesting that we keep so many different stats in cricket, but we never actually look at coaching records. Like Cricinfo and CricBuzz, and you could add here Cricket Archive and Crickmetric and I don't know, any website you like, cricket.com. None of them really look at coaches, and other than the odd article or the odd tweet or something on social media, you almost never hear anything about what a coach's record is in cricket. What you might get occasionally is for an individual team, but we don't see it as a career number, right? And it goes all the way through, because if you look at Wikipedia, it's very similar. In fact, Wikipedia is a better place of actually getting some information about cricket coaches, because at least on Wikipedia, they usually track when someone has got the job and when they've lost it. So if you really, really don't like a coach, you can go to Wikipedia and you can look that up, and then you can look up the team's individual record. A lot of that's hard. So most of the things you actually hear about coaching in the mainstream media and even social media and everywhere else is just people with different agendas, right? Like, they like this star player, so they talk down the coach, or the opposite of that, right? And occasionally coaches end up with their own cult followings. Like someone like Mike Hesson, he suddenly had this great following. And obviously Brendan McCullum has become almost more of a cult than a coach at certain points. And so when you get agenda-led commentary with really nothing that can be found anywhere else, it just means that the conversations about coaching is shit to begin with, right? The media don't ask the right questions, the players don't really know how to explain it, and so it's either not covered or it's covered really poorly. Essentially, most of the stuff we ever hear about coaches is when they're about to be fired. And at that stage, probably something's already broken down. And also, our sport is more confusing than other sports. We have international coaches, which are obviously really, really important, and we have franchise coaches. These are two very, very different jobs. In international sport, you more or less just have the players who are available to you, right? You can be the greatest international coach of all time, and if you don't have a team that can, I don't know, make any runs or take any wickets, you're probably going to look pretty crap. On top of this, we don't seem to give international coaches that long of a run anymore. They kind of go between cycles in weird phases, and it's actually hard to see them over a long period of time. Conditions play a part, the opposition plays a part, all these things come into international cricket. And franchise cricket brings about its own problems as well. You can be a great coach, but when it comes down to it, if you have bad management and if you have bad ownership, chances are you're not going to be successful over a long period of time. Most coaches have very little to do with actually picking the sides these days. And so a bad general manager, a bad selector, a bad director of cricket, whatever that title is, or just an owner who wants certain players involved, can cause all sorts of problems at the franchise level. But let's start by looking at some of the best coaches in the world, certainly by reputation, which is kind of all we have to go by anyway. Jonathan Trott, recently, what he's done with Afghanistan certainly has to get onto this list, right? But I don't think anyone would say he has a genuine claim for a top 10 coach. Brendan McCullum, we might need to see what he does with the England white ball team, but I don't think anyone could argue that he's had a huge impact in the way that England has played their cricket, and that is kind of the job of a coach. And he's made a lot of very average players believe in themselves quite a bit. He took over from Trevor Bayliss. England's former World Cup winning coach was, of course, Trevor Bayliss. He's still hanging around the franchise area and has done a bit of it, but I still think he's probably another one of these international coaches. Shastri's probably finished his coaching, and even though he had a very good Indian team, it still looked like to me from the outside that he gave them an incredible focus. Chris Silverwood was dumped by England and then went and did really, really good things in Sri Lanka. Like, Sri Lanka have started to put together a really interesting side. And in Test cricket, they completely overperformed, certainly what my expectations were. And that's one of the things you're looking for, right? Like, is the team on paper doing better than you expect it to consistently? That's when we start to give credit to the coach. Phil Simmons doesn't seem to get talked about all that much when we're talking about the greatest coaches in the world. but he played a huge part in the fact that Ireland got good and like won World Cups for the West Indies. Andrew McDonald now has won World Cups as well. He was kind of the poster child for this assistant coach that very few people even remembered his playing career, and suddenly everyone was talking about him as a coach. But he looks really organised, and Australia's done well in like every format. He has to get a huge amount of credit for that. Hatra Singer is a bit like Mott, right? Like these two have just lost their jobs. And he's a weird coach because he's so didactic and screamy and yelly, and not all the players like him. But he also just took Bangladesh to Pakistan and won the series 2-0 and then lost his job. Gary Stead was a big part of the reason that New Zealand went to #1 in the world. You've also got Rob Walter in here and Dave Howden. Now, I've just put all these names out here. I'm not saying any of these are in the top 10 of the world. I'm not even trying to come up with a list like that because that would be absolute madness. But what I really wanted to do is have a look at all these international coaches for 1 second. Just have a look at them and tell me that there is not a name on this list that you, your friend, your uncle, that woman at the bus stop doesn't think is a terrible coach. Because there's no way there isn't, right? Like I have showed you, and I can give you cases for all of these coaches and why they're very good, including someone like Mott as well. And you or your angry friend will tell me how I am absolutely wrong. Like I can already see the comments on YouTube before we finish making the video for this one. And these coaches are really fascinating as well because international cricket is still where there's more passion. Like the IPL is starting to come up and there's a lot of T20 fans. But when it comes down to it, the most passionate reaction fans are going to have about coaches are going to be the international ones. So I would expect people to be really, really on either side of these ones. Whereas if you come to the franchise, which we put Rahul Dravid in here, obviously 5 minutes ago he wasn't in this section, but he is now. Think of the step down that this man just took. Look, I'm not saying Rajasthan fans can't get upset at things, right? But Rahul Dravid, this is like a retirement job compared to coaching India, right? Like this is a much easier gig and he's probably going to stick in it a lot longer, even if his team isn't as good. Stephen Fleming's, I think, is really interesting. Obviously, I was an analyst under Stephen Fleming, so I kind of have an insight there. I think he's a really, really good coach, but I don't think you can argue that the whole Chennai machine has been brilliant and not just Fleming. Andy Flower is really interesting. I would argue now he's more adaptive, maybe progressive, and certainly better with his players than he was when he was an international coach all that time back. But he hasn't been able to always consistently get the same results. Although, having said that, I don't have access to all of his coaching results. Maybe he's winning like 70% of his games and it just doesn't look good because of the IPL. There was a period of time at which everyone loved Mahela as coach. Feels like that's waned a little bit, but still a very high-level coach. Mike Hesson made most of his reputation, obviously, with New Zealand, but then has gone on to be in the IPL as well. Ricky Ponting, Cheyenne told me to put Ricky Ponting on the list. I think there's a lot of contentious coaches here, but I would say about Ricky Ponting is that when Delhi were flying with that young crop of players, he looked like a fantastic coach. Maybe he hasn't looked at that level ever since. Sangakkara is a really interesting one because Rajasthan have looked incredibly organised and like they've had a clear plan under him, but they haven't actually won a title, and so people will get upset at that. And then Pandit, of course, he just came in and won the title for KKR. I think Pandit is a really interesting one because I think there's a lot of coaches out there like Pandit in many different leagues in the world who are not big name former players and maybe aren't the face of their franchise and are probably really good. But I know about Pandit because he did it in the IPL. So how many other coaches are fantastic and not even on this board? That was the first question I had. And there's a real reason why I had that. And it's because of this person here, Greg Shipperd. So we looked up all the franchise cricket in the last couple of years to look at who the teams were that were the most winningest. And Greg Shipperd was the coach of the Sydney Sixers. And they've won 48 games and lost 23. That is a fantastic record if you're going 48 and only losing 23. They did win 2 titles as well. So it's not as if it's empty calories, right? But I happen to know a lot more about Greg Shipperd as a coach. Like he was in charge of Tasmania when they won their first ever Sheffield Shield title. He also got that team to a bunch of finals. Then he came back home to Victoria, which is where I really started to watch Greg Shipperd because I was a Victorian cricket fan. And in Victoria, he won 4 Sheffield Shield titles. He was absolutely phenomenal. They were so dominant, that team. And since then, he's gone off to coach some other thing. He got Melbourne Stars to, I don't know, I've written down 4 finals. Does that sound right? Did Melbourne Stars actually make 4 finals? But that's what I've written down here anyway. But he was very good with the Melbourne Stars. He went to Delhi at the start of the IPL run and didn't actually do all that much. So most of his record has been in the Big Bash or in Sheffield Shield cricket. That doesn't make Greg Shipperd a very famous coach, but 48 and 23 is still an incredible record. But because it happened to Greg Shipperd outside of the IPL and not at the major international level, and let's be honest, with Greg Shipperd, you're going to have to go Google him later on to actually see if this guy really exists or not. He does. That is really boring, by the way. No one even seems to know about it. And yet Greg Shipperd isn't just a great coach. He actually produces great coaches. Like, there are other people on this list at the moment that you can link to Greg Shipperd. Either he coached them or he had something to do with them actually becoming a coach as well. Like, Greg Shipperd may not be a famous name in cricket, but if I go through all the different people that he'd been involved with that went on to be coaches, like, he is the coach's coach. And yet if I just put his name in this list up above earlier, you all would have been like, who? And if you think that is a who, I got a better one for you. Adrien Burell. Adrien Burell is another person who I have heard so many great things about as a coach. Adrien Burell in Ireland is talked about like a guru. Do you want to know why? Because Adrien Burell was in charge when Ireland beat Pakistan. But also when you go back and you talk to the old Irish players, they all said just how much they learned from him. Now, they also love their coach, Phil Simmons. So maybe the real key here is to go and coach Ireland. But the reason Adrien Burell is here is not for what he did almost 20 years ago for Ireland. It's what he has done for the Sunrisers. And when I'm talking about the Sunrisers here, I am talking specifically about the Eastern Cape Sunrisers. Their record under him is also absolutely off the charts. There is no doubt that even though almost no one here knows who Adrien Burell is, he's a brilliant cricket coach as well. Or at the very least, he had a good side. You see what the issue is here. But I'm pretty sure Adrien Burell is a great coach. And the Sunrisers thing is really, really interesting because there's one name here that you might have seen just sneaking by in my head, and that is Tom Moody. Now, Tom Moody is funny when it comes to talking about coaching, not because he's bad at it, because at one stage his name was linked to every single coaching job that was done. Basically, a cricket board would decide they needed a new coach, and the first thing that you would hear is that Tom Moody was available. It's like he had the greatest agent of all time that just had him in every single conversation. But of recent times, if you've been following the 100, you'll realize that Tom Moody's record as coach is 22-10. Again, those sorts of records, anytime you're over 60% in T20 cricket, it's incredible. And the 100 is probably more so because it's not even T20 cricket. And then if you look at the history of this as well, remember that Tom Moody coached Sri Lanka at one stage and got them into a World Cup final. Tom Moody has form as a coach over like a 17-year career, right? But it's not to say that he's like a magic coach. His teams don't always have success when he's in charge. But he also then won an IPL title. And who did he win that IPL title with? It was with the Sunrisers. A World Cup final, an IPL title, and absolute dominance in the 100. You would have to suggest that Tom Moody is a good coach. But you will see from the comments that there are a lot of people who do not believe that Moody is a good coach. But weirdly, this all comes back to the Sunrisers, because the other person that people are going to say over and over again is not a good coach is Daniel Vettori. And not just because of that Wigmore piece, although that was certainly a part of it, but because we've all seen him get so many jobs and have so much talent and not do much with it. Except for the fact that the most interesting side in the IPL last year were the Sunrisers. And they are coached by Daniel Vettori. And yes, it was Pandit who ended up holding the trophy, but it would be hard to watch that IPL last year and also think that Vettori hadn't done an incredible job with a very interesting new method of cricket of just trying to hit every single ball for six. Which is, weirdly enough, pretty much exactly what Daniel Vettori was trying to do with the Brisbane Heat all those years ago when they kept losing, and also what he was trying to do with RCB at times. So does that mean that cricket has now caught up to Vettori's vision? And that he's now a good coach when he was a bad coach before? And let us be really clear here, because of pretty much all of this here, none of us know the answers. I'm pretty sure that Vettori is not the best coach in the world. But I'm not sure that he's not in the top 10. In fact, I'm not sure who on this board should be in the top 10 and shouldn't be in the top 10. So if us as fans can't even have a decent conversation, not even a good conversation, just a decent conversation about who the best coaches in the world might be, how do the international teams and all the franchises teams actually make their decision? Like, is it just as random as this board? Oh my God, please tell me it is not as random as this board. It is though, right? I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption.
We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories, like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the Empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.